collective action to protect and restore our rivers, return healthy soils and diverse wildlife to our lands, and transform how we care for the earth and for each other. We're also the Illinois affiliate of the National Wildlife Federation, and our program areas are very broad and far-reaching, but all of them focus on protecting Illinois waterways and natural resources for the people and wildlife that depend on them. Our staff work on renewable energy issues for the communities of Illinois, climate change, river corridor health, river corridor protection, wildlife habitat protection, pollinator habitat protection, regenerative agriculture, and pesticides. And we also collaborate with a lot of our partners around the state to help build policies that support the protection of the environment. In today's talk, I'm going to touch on 5 main topics. This is a really big, complex issue, and the information I'm going to provide today is really just a brief overview. And we're going to start off talking about our changing landscape, what that means and why it's important. Then go into a very brief introduction of pesticides and herbicides, and talk about herbicide drift. And then I'll introduce our tree and plant health monitoring program, and we'll talk about a more sustainable vision for Illinois and other actions that we're taking to protect biodiversity. Now, if we were in person, I would ask how many of you know what this is, or to describe this photo for me. And some of you may say it's a planting of a bunch of flowers, or it's an ecosystem and a habitat, and you'd all be right. This picture is a prairie. It was taken in mid-July, and as you can see, it's mostly yellow and white with a little bit of orange and a lot of green. If you were to visit it a couple weeks before, you would have seen that it was purple, blue, white, and a lot of green. And then if you were to revisit it about 4 to 5 weeks after this photo was taken, sometime around mid-August, you would notice that it was white with a lot of purple and more green and gold. And then finally, if you were to go back at fall and take a look and walk around, you would see that it's mostly gold, orange, tan, and brown. And that's because this prairie is full of life. It's full of diverse plant types. Some of them are forbs or flowering plants. A lot of them are grasses. They bloom at different times of the year. They have different shaped flowers, different shaped leaves. They mature their seeds at different times of the year, and they fall off into the ground. This ecosystem, this prairie ecosystem, has adapted and evolved. And along with it, the animals that reside in this area have adapted and evolved. And this is actually a prairie on our property here in Southern Illinois that my husband and I take care of. And it's something that we do in our lives, but it's also something that we both work on professionally, is just caring for ecosystems and the environment. Now, this is a map of Illinois, and if you'll notice on your left, these maps are showing the land cover of Illinois. And on your left is a map of the land cover in the early 1800s. The tannish colors represent prairie, and the green represent forest. The blue is showing our streams and water bodies, and the pink areas are areas of settlement. And you'll notice that the majority of the land cover in the early 1800s is prairie and forest. And this represents a tremendous amount of biodiversity across the landscape. And if you look at present day land cover in Illinois, it's much different. And this map's a little bit old, but I think that it's still a good representation of how we use our land today. And the yellow in this map, it represents agricultural land. And the green is the forest, and the pink, as you can tell, is the developed lands or the settled lands, and that's more prominent than it was on the map on the left. One of the things that you'll notice is that this agricultural land really dominates the landscape. And there are many types of farms that take up this land, but the majority of this land is used to produce 2 crops, corn and soybeans. So we've reduced all of that biodiversity down to just a few different types of plant species on the map. And so, you know, one of the things that we notice when we're out is that a lot of little injuries can add up to be a big problem. And I'm sure you've all learned in your biology and ecology classes that everything's connected. And what seems like little changes in our environment can add up very quickly and have a very big impact. This is especially true where lots of people are making changes or similar changes in the environment. Something small on a local scale can become a major issue regionally or globally. The same is true for ecosystem health as a whole. Lots of little injuries can cause complicated and very large problems. When we look at our landscape and examine how we're changing it, we notice lots of little injuries, the cumulative actions of tearing down miles of fence rows and field borders, places where plants could grow wild and animals could forage, find cover or nest, adds up to a major issue, one big injury on the landscape. Additionally, there's non-native plant and animal species that compete with our native species for resources and space. We have urban sprawl, there's stream and wetland alteration and destruction, there's threats from pollution and insecticide, and we mow where there was never mowing before. The list could go on and on. And so why is it so important for us to protect biodiversity? Well, it takes diversity to support diversity, to support biodiversity. Habitats rich in plant types, like I just showed you with that prairie, with different flowers, flower types that bloom different times of the year, plants that develop their seeds at different times of the year, support a lot of different diverse animal species. It is estimated that our pollinators, such as flies, moths, bees, bumblebees, wasps, butterflies, hummingbirds, are responsible for every third bite of food that we eat. That's how much we rely on their services. You know, the ants, beetles, grasshoppers, lacewings, leafhoppers, etc., thousands of species of insects, they all play invaluable roles in our ecosystem. They serve as predators. They control pests that we don't want in our gardens and farm fields. They serve as decomposers, and they break down decaying material. They're also prey for spiders, other insects, birds, mammals, fish, amphibians, and reptiles. And in many ways, they really make our ecosystems run. So it's critical that we protect our ecosystems and ensure that they can function in a way that they evolve to. And this is a complex problem, one that we've created, and a problem that will take many different actions and steps to solve. So let's talk a little bit about pesticides and herbicides and what they mean for ecosystem health. This is a photo of a redbud tree. It's a very common tree in the US. Many of you probably have them in your yards. They have these big, beautiful heart-shaped leaves in the summer and these pink purplish little flowers in the spring, which are really important sources of early sources of nectar for a lot of native bees. And this one here has cupped, curled leaves, and you'll notice that some of the edges are even scalloped. This is a classic symptom of exposure to a plant growth regulator herbicide, or a PGR herbicide, which we'll talk more about in a minute. First, let's talk about what is a pesticide. A pesticide is any substance or mixture of substances intended for preventing, destroying, repelling, or mitigating any pest. As a plant, it can be used as a plant regulator, defoliant, or desiccant to dry it up. It can also be used as a nitrogen stabilizer. There's lots of examples, many of them that you know, insecticides, rodenticides, fungicides, nematicides, herbicides. We're going to focus on the herbicides. Now, herbicides target plants. And there's many, many types of herbicides, and they can be classified in a lot of different ways. One way in which they can be described is by their mode of action. Simply put, a mode of action identifies the processes in the plant that the herbicide interrupts or modifies. So our monitoring program, which I'll show you shortly, focuses mainly on plant growth regulator herbicides, or PGR herbicides. And basically, these herbicides interfere with the normal growth processes of broadleaf plants like clovers and chickweed, things like that. Growth regulator herbicides can act at multiple sites, and and they can disrupt hormone balances and protein synthesis and cause a variety of growth abnormalities in the plants that are exposed to them. As I said, they're used to control broadleaf weeds. Herbicides in this group can move through the xylem and the phloem to areas of new plant growth. So they can be transported through the plant. So who uses all these herbicides? Well, lots of people, and they come in lots of different forms. But they're commonly used in lawn and landscaping treatments and wildland management for control of invasive species. Mainly in lawn and landscaping treatments, they're used for the control. People like their nice clean lawns without clover or any other plants. They just like the grass. So they'll use these herbicides to control those broadleaf weeds or plants. They're not weeds in most cases. And they're also used widely in agriculture to control weeds in the rows. And many people believe that pesticides quickly break down in the environment, and some do, many do, degrade in a rather short period of time. But many can persist for weeks, months, or in some cases, as we've learned the hard way, they can persist for years. Pesticides can move through the environment in several different ways, and they can do so during or after application. This graphic shows some of the ways, but not all, that pesticides can move through the environment. They can seep through the ground, they can wash off and flow into water bodies during rain events. They can evaporate and move long distances in the atmosphere, landing at another location, and they can drift in the wind during application. There's many other ways that they can also move through the environment, though. And let's talk real briefly about herbicide drift. Herbicide drift is the movement of a herbicide away from the target area. I'm going to talk about two types of drift: particle drift and vapor drift. Particle drift occurs during application. Small droplets can be blown onto unintended plants if it's a windy day. Sometimes even a very low wind can cause particle drift. Vapor drift occurs when the herbicide evaporates from the droplets when they leave the sprayer, or when it evaporates from the plant and ground surfaces after spraying. Some herbicides can evaporate from plant or soil surfaces even days after they've been applied. Like droplets can get blown in the wind, this vaporized herbicide can be carried from the target areas. The vapor can remain suspended in the air until the contaminated air is forced back down to the ground, where it can damage growing plants. Vaporized herbicide can drift for long distances, and typically with vapor drift damage, there are no clear gradients or pattern that can be seen. In other words, it won't just be like you see the edge of a tree line that has been damaged, or one half of the trees have been damaged. It's usually, there's no noticeable pattern in the injury to the plants. And the damage from vapor drift can be widespread. And on the next two slides, I'm going to show you some graphs from the U.S. Geological Survey. This first graph shows estimated agricultural use of growth regulator herbicide, commonly known as 2,4-D. 2,4-D is widely used, but this graph just shows agricultural uses. It's also important to note that we're looking at low estimates of use for 2,4-D. As you can see, the use of this herbicide has been steadily increasing since about 2011. And in 2016 and 17, looking at the graph, you can estimate that around 42 to 43 million pounds of 2,4-D were used to control broadleaf weeds in agricultural areas. This includes row crops such as corn, soybeans, wheat, cotton, as well as the production of alfalfa, pasture, and hay. The second slide shows estimates of the agricultural use of another commonly used growth regulator herbicide, dicamba. Dicamba has been around for a very long time, just like 2,4-D, but it wasn't until recently that its use has skyrocketed. New formulations of the herbicide were released in time for the 2017 growing season, and these new formulations allowed for the use of this herbicide over the top of growing soybean and cotton plants that were designed to be resistant to the herbicide, meaning that these special cotton and soybean seeds grow plants that won't be killed when dicamba is sprayed in their fields for weed control. As you can see, since the release of the new herbicide-resistant crops, paired with the formulations of herbicide used of the new herbicide, the use of dicamba expanded across millions of acres of American farmland. Again, these figures are from the USDS, both the 2017 map and the graph of use by year and crop are actually low estimates of agricultural use of dicamba. And you can see the spike, I wish I could show you with a laser pointer, you can see the spike in 2017, which is the most recent year of data that is available from this data set. The amount of dicamba applied to all US crops more than doubled in 2017 relative to 2016. And this is largely driven by the increased use in soybeans and cotton. So I used 2,4-D and dicamba as examples of growth regulator herbicides because they're both widely used in the US and they're both known to volatilize and cause injury on unintended plants. But they're not the only growth regulator herbicides used, and it's not just agricultural use that can cause unintended injuries to trees and other plants. Herbicide injuries to plants have been occurring for as long as we've been using the herbicides, but complaints of suspected herbicide drift and injuries to crops, specialty crops, and wild plants have been on the rise for the past several years. I should note here that there are methods for reporting suspected injury to crops, wild plants, and property. However, the majority of the cases this complaint process deals with are based on applicator error, or the complaint process focuses on mainly applicator error and misuse, and does not really examine the broader implications or risks that this widespread use poses to the ecosystem's health. I should note here before we move on that our monitoring program is not intended to take the place of the state reporting process. We always encourage landowners to report suspected injuries to the Illinois Department of Agriculture or whatever pesticide regulating agency they have in that state. But our monitoring program was designed as an attempt to better understand if and how herbicide drift is impacting native plant communities. As you can see in the slide here, herbicide drift is indiscriminate in where it lands and what it harms. It can happen to row crops like these soybeans here with the cupped and curled leaves. It can happen to specialty crops like this tomato here with cupped and curled leaves, peaches, apples, peach trees, apple trees. Lots of specialty crops can be sensitive to growth regulator herbicides. And it also can harm wild plants. And the picture on the right is sycamore leaves. And these are very cupped and curled. Sycamore leaves are typically really big, wide, flat leaves. So in order to gain a better understanding of what's happening to our trees and plants here in Illinois and respond to the numerous calls, emails, letters that we receive each year about suspected injury to people's crops or plants in their backyards, we started our tree and plant health monitoring program. And I need to say this project simply would not exist without the dedication and the knowledge of some very talented, smart volunteers that Prairie Rivers has. These volunteers have helped design this program with me. They've helped train other volunteers with us about how to monitor. They've helped gather data, they've helped analyze data with us, and they've helped communicate this issue to other groups and individuals around the state. Martin Kemper is a retired biologist with the Illinois Department of Natural Resources. Marty especially played a key role in developing this program and helping us keep the monitoring program alive and well. Again, our program is not our program is designed to document symptoms that are indicative of exposure of plant growth regulator herbicides, specifically in trees and plants. And so we've done this so we can gain a better understanding of this issue, including the geographic distribution of symptoms, like where they are occurring and where they aren't occurring. The severity of the symptoms, are they light, are they medium, are they more severe? And what types of species are we seeing symptoms in? Or what species appear to be the most susceptible? So this is a picture of our monitoring form, and I'm not going to go through the whole form, but I think it's important to talk about some key things that we're trying to collect. Mainly, we really want to know, there's about 6 or 7 key things. First, the location. We want to know where the volunteer is observing symptoms. We want to know when, so we need the date. The observations have been taking place, are taking place. We also want to know the symptoms. So we have a list of symptoms here that they can mark. There's indicative symptoms, and there's additional symptoms. We want to know what species are showing symptoms, what trees, what types of plants, what types of vines, what families, what species are showing symptoms, and how many of each species are showing symptoms, and then how severe are those symptoms. We also want to know the area where this is being observed. Is it a large area of 30, 40 acres? Is it a smaller area like a homestead of under an acre? Or is it a linear pattern that they're seeing if they're walking down a corridor and they're observing injuries in the corridor? And finally, we also want to know if there's a pattern to the symptoms. Are all the plants in the area equally affected? Is only one side of a plant showing symptoms? Is the whole plant showing symptoms? Is it coming from are symptoms only on the north side or the south side of plants in the area? So landowners and land managers in many Midwestern and South Central states have reported injuries that are symptomatic of exposure to growth regulator herbicides for several years. And here are a few examples of trees showing symptoms of herbicide exposure. These are typical symptoms that a volunteer might report in the monitoring program. And if you look here on the left, this is a photograph of a bur oak. And you'll notice that these leaves are really long and slender. And bur oaks usually have a wider, fatter leaf. In the center, we have a photograph of a post oak. And these leaves are twisted, curled, or cupped a little bit and deformed. They're stunted. And you don't really have to know what a post oak leaf looks like to realize that this is not a healthy leaf. These leaves have something wrong with them. On the right, again, a red bud. It's really hard sometimes to find a normal looking red bud in Illinois right now, but a lot of the symptoms in red buds are these curled cupped leaves. And you'll also notice on these leaves that there's a little bit of serration or cupped, little serration on the edges of the leaf. And that is not uncommon either. This is actually a page out of our 2018 and 2019 Tree and Plant Health Monitoring Report, where we summarize the data for 2 years of monitoring. This shows the possible range and severity of symptoms of herbicide injury that can be seen out in the field in a single species. And this is a white oak. And you'll notice at the top left, we have normal looking leaves. And moving left to right, down and across the page like you would read, you'll notice that the severity of the symptoms in the photographs go up, and that's how we've done our ranking. And so a symptom at a level of 1 to 2, we consider that slight. And then all the way up to a 9 or a 10. And 9 is where we would see dieback, branch dieback in a tree, and 10 would be tree death or whole plant death. When we began this monitoring program, there was no known ecological monitoring program in place that was documenting symptoms of possible herbicide injury to native plants and native trees. Prairie Rivers Network and our partners were really concerned about the potential ecological impacts of these events. And, we know that, for example, the largest risk to herbicides use to bees, the largest risk of herbicide use to bees and other insects is declines in forage diversity, forage quality. And studies have shown that drift rates of dicamba can reduce the diversity of forage that's available, the quality of that forage, and the number of flowers that are produced on a plant. We also know that flowers that are exposed to herbicide drift are visited less frequently by pollinators. So in areas that experience multiple drift events in a year, and for several years in a row, what does that mean to the health and the vigor of the plants that are exposed? Additionally, if plant death or reduced or delayed flowering from herbicide drift events occurs, how does that potentially lead to the loss of the interactions and important interactions in plant and pollinator networks? So while this is while there's a fairly large body of research on pesticides, there remains significant knowledge gaps regarding the potential impacts of widespread herbicide use and their impacts on native plant and animal communities. Numerous questions remain. For example, how much of the herbicides are volatilizing, and where and at what rates are they landing on unintended plants? What are the short and long-term impacts to plants, trees, and other wildlife that depend on them? How are nectar, seed, pollen, fruit, and nut production being affected? If current herbicide rates continue or increase, or use rates continue or increase, will species composition in our critical habitat areas shift? And additionally, what are the environmental loadings to our rivers and streams, our water resources and aquatic habitats? So as you can see, the issue of pesticide use is, and in this case, herbicide use, extremely complex. And especially when we have herbicides that are being used over such large areas of land. The issue of the impacts of such use to environmental health is extremely complicated, and it's an important issue, and every bit of information that we gather increases our bit of understanding, but it also really leads us to a lot more questions. So in this slide, I just wanted to share with you some of the other things that we're doing aside from our monitoring program that are helping us protect biodiversity. We collaborate a lot with other nonprofits, researchers, farmers, agencies, and landowners to try to think of new solutions or new approaches to this problem. We also are working to help farmers shift away from herbicide-only tools to more ecological weed management tools for managing their farms. We also work together collaboratively to promote and request more funding for public research and independent research into these areas. And we work with landowners and encourage them to embrace that wild lawn, that dandelion, and to reduce or eliminate the use of lawn chemicals on their property. So with that, I'm going to wrap it up, but feel free, please, to reach out to me if you have any questions or concerns. And at this point, I can take some questions, Debbie.
Hey, that was really informative. Sorry, there's some excitement going on in my back. We were talking earlier today about how challenging and interesting it is to do these kinds of. Sorry, how challenging it is to do this. There are some questions, and one of the questions just came in. I'm going to start with that because that's where you sort of left off. And the question is about when someone buys an herbicide, you know, does it actually tell them on the label how to use it? And if they use it appropriately or as directed, do we reduce these risks? And I think we'll start there, and then there's a synergistic question. And so let's start there.
Sure. So I'm not a weed scientist, I'm an ecologist, I'm focused on invertebrates, but I can answer that question as best I can. Yes, that when you buy a herbicide or any pesticide, there are label instructions on that container. And that is the law. That is how you are supposed to legally and safely apply that pesticide. So was there a second part to that question, Debbie?
Yeah, I think the second part is more just from my interest in talking about that. If each individual person uses the product as suggested, mm-hmm. that truly reduce the whole ecosystem risk, because this was just so enlightening and makes me understand how big of a system, like really for your work, you have to look at the whole system, and it's not like they have boundaries, right? It's not like there's this hard, right. And so it's that whole synergistic part of my goodness, even if somebody uses it appropriately, does that work?
Yeah, well, I think it depends on the herbicide. It certainly helps no matter what you're using. If you use it correctly, some pesticides are more volatile than others, and some are more water soluble than others. And so even if you apply it according to the label and you get a pop-up rainstorm that you didn't think you were going to get, you know, that herbicide or pesticide can wash away and you don't have any control over that. So, you know, using it the right way is the most important, but you also, it's really important, you know, check your weather really well, make sure you know what's going to happen. And, you know, if there's a risk, you know, don't apply if it's going to interfere with the efficacy of that chemical.
And there's a question on YouTube. I think they were impacted where you were talking about those. I think it was from those images that you had about the dicambia. So the question, it states, so with a change of a crop, so when we change a crop type, it can lead to a change in a pesticide or herbicides that is used. And I think there's just a follow-up question of that being true. And then just how do you guys stay on top of it is what I'm wondering.
So I'm not sure I understand the first part of the question.
I think they were impressed by that chart that you had, because it popped up about the question popped up about the time you had the graphic of dicambia and 2017 increase.
Yeah.
And I think what they are trying to get at is every time a plant crop changes, do you have to monitor or figure out does the pesticide and herbicide change too?
Yeah, so we don't. I mean, there's the U.S. Geological Survey, and there's EPA, and there's other agencies that are doing biological monitoring and gathering that data. And there's, you know, I'm really interested to see the data from 2018 to now, whenever that comes out, because I'd like to see how that trend continues. But yeah, I mean, especially when we're talking about crop technologies that have been developed where the plant will be resistant to herbicides. So they can use those herbicides on top of that plant, and that plant can still grow, even though it's a broadleaf, it can still grow when you spray a broadleaf herbicide. So that, that certainly changes behaviors on the landscape and gives farmers the opportunity to use those herbicides when they couldn't use them before. So they may have used dicamba before those seeds came out, but now they can use dicamba throughout the growing season. And we do know that volatility tends to increase, particularly with dicamba, as temperature increases. So the warmer it gets, the later in the summer it gets warmer, right? That risk of volatility also increases. So there's a lot of things going on there that are coming into play with why we think we're seeing a lot of these increased complaints and injuries on the landscape. And temperature and seasonality is a big part of that.
I love that you use the word injury. I've not heard anybody use that before, but it makes such sense. So another question from YouTube actually is, well, what can be done if I don't use an herbicide, but maybe my neighbor does? And I think what they're talking about is drift. So if I don't want to use the chemical, but my neighbor is using it and I'm noticing that, what would you suggest?
Well, I mean, the best thing to do is talk with your neighbor and explain to them, especially if you are seeing symptoms of injury on your plants and trees, then, you just need to have that relationship with them to where you can communicate that. You can report injuries to the Illinois Department of Agriculture. And I always encourage landowners, if they have symptoms of herbicide drift on their property, that they report that to IDOA, because IDOA uses that information to, make regulations and rules.
This seems like such a big, so much of this is education, I think. It's just so much education. So are there times when we have to use an herbicide? And I'm wondering if this person is maybe thinking about from a restoration standpoint.
Yeah.
Restoration?
Herbicides are magnificent tools and for certain things. We have used herbicides to control autumn olive. We cut up the tree and we stump treat for invasive species on our property. And they are really a great way to manage invasive species. But I think that, we have to be conscientious of the type of herbicide we're using. If we're using one that is really a high risk for volatility, then we need to think about that and see if there's another option. And I think that's true with any type of chemical you use. You want to use the least harmful choice possible when you have to use it. And if you can use other methods to achieve the same goal without using a chemical, then by all means, use those methods. It would be better for, the environment for sure.
There's another question that came in, but I want to ask a follow-up question to that one. If I'm someone who wants to make sure that I'm using a chemical and not going to create drift, and I want to know what those better chemical choices are, would you guys be an organization we could contact to ask that question? Or is there?
I would probably refer you to some of the really awesome weed scientists that we have in the state, or some of the farmers that we work with really closely that, have a really good understanding of, different options and ways to accomplish the same goal with different pesticides or without using pesticides. So.
And then I like this question because I think I might have missed something. How long have these drifting herbicides been around? And then I remember you talking about there's vapor and there's vapor and liquid. Is that what you?
There's vapor and there's particle.
Particle. Okay.
So that the droplets basically that blow in the wind or move during application, and the vapor is when the chemical actually essentially evaporates or vaporizes into the atmosphere, and it can move or it can hang out for a while. First part of the question.
I think, so I'm just wondering, so this question, and I didn't mean to be, it triggered a question to me. The original question was, how long have these drifting herbicides?
Oh.
And that made me think about, well, vapor versus particle is one of them more likely to drift?
Yeah, it depends. My understanding is it depends on the chemistry of the chemical at hand. You know, some of these herbicides have been around for decades and decades. 2,4-D and dicamba have been around. You know, my grandfather probably used them. So, but you know, again, it's the changes in the landscape. You know, now people want that clean grass lawn, and now, you know, we want to have a really clean farm field, and these are really quick and easy fixes for those problems.
On Facebook, this is just, I think they were just emphasizing something you said, but why should we love dandelions, or why should we leave dandelions? Someone was very happy you said that.
Yeah, you know, lawns, I'm not a huge fan of lawns in general, but I think that, you know, if we can leave biodiversity in place, if we can leave clover, if we can leave dandelions, if we can leave plantain and all these things, that increases the life that can exist in that lawn. And you know, life is messy. Ecosystems are complex. They're, you know, jagged and rough and dirty and beautiful. And I think that we have a tendency as people to want to have everything sterile, neat, and clean, when that's really not a good way to thrive as a living thing. We need complexity, and those dandelions represent that. You know, they're important food sources for some of our pollinators when there's really not a whole lot else available for them.
In the springtime. So you mentioned that you're an invertebrate expert. I love invertebrates. I love aquatic invertebrates. They're so cool. And so just for the benefit of everybody watching, why, as an invertebrate specialist, do you need to know about plants?
Well, they've evolved together, and a lot of our invertebrates are really very reliant on plant species for their survival. I mean, oak trees, you know, oaks are a keystone species in our forests, and they support over 500 lepidopteran, moth and butterfly species, and they're critical. I mean, that's critical for migratory birds that come through every year. They feed their young, those caterpillars. You know, everything works together, and insects play a critical role in that, and they're just cool.
They are so cool. Let's see those relationships. I'm getting text messages now, and so I think this is from a 4th grade class actually, and they want to know how you decided, like how did you decide to study insects, and how did you get into this field? How did you decide that you wanted to do this?
I grew up in Virginia. I grew up hiking the Appalachian Trail and playing in the big, beautiful rivers out there. And one of my favorite things has always been hearing the cicadas and playing in streams and turning over rocks and looking at all the insects. And I've always had a love for that. And I knew I always wanted to be a biologist, but I kind of took a crazy route. And I've always at heart been an advocate. So working for nonprofits has been my career choice for the majority of my career, and I really like it.
That brings up an excellent point. So we've been asking scientists all kinds of questions about being a scientist. And one of the popular questions that come forward is, how much time do you spend in the field? And you were talking about this before we opened. We talked to Dr. Sharma, who studies snow leopards in Nepal, and he said that his field time is about 30% of his time, and the rest of his time he's bringing that data back and manipulating it. You and I were talking about the fact that you might actually get to spend a little more time in the field because your role is a little bit different.
Yeah, we're an advocacy organization, and so, you know, the monitoring program is really the more sciencey part of my job, even though it's a volunteer-based monitoring program. But I get to spend a lot of time in the field working with landowners and farmers and collaborating with partners. And so I'd say, anywhere from 40 to 50% of my time is out on people's property or out on a farm and working with people. So it's changed a little bit since COVID, but everything has changed. I don't get to do that quite as much as I used to pre-COVID. I hope it goes back.
Yes, yes. And so if you're a student thinking about going into a field, that might be something to consider. Do I want to do research or do I want to do advocacy? Because it's true that if you're a research scientist, you're actually maybe in the field a little less than an advocacy scientist like you are.
Yeah, and they're very different. I mean, they're just the type of work that you do is very different. So I'm more big picture and less, one particular issue. So.
And then I have a follow-up question to that. My goodness, the work that you're doing, because I've studied ecosystems before, and I've tried to help work on as a citizen scientist, help work on solving those kind of problems. What you just outlaid, I'm not sure everyone is understanding just how complicated it is. And I'm wondering your agency, like your research and the stuff that you're doing and you're learning, how much of that do you get before policymakers? So in, how much does the Illinois River Prairie Network, how much are you guys advocating for policy change in our state capital, Springfield?
Yeah, so I think it depends on the program area and the time of what's happening in Springfield and just where we are in a particular program. But as a nonprofit, we can only spend a small portion of our time actually advocating for policy change. So it's not a huge chunk of our time, but it is that the information and the work that we do is all in advocacy in general, just kind of try to inform and to educate people and to influence.
And I love that because we can make a lot of policies and we have policies in place, but I think it is that advocacy and educating people. Okay, fourth grade class wants to know what your favorite insect is and why. And you could say insect or plant, either one.
Oh. That is a really, really tough one. I'm going to go with the silk moths, just in general, because I think that they are just so fun. They get huge. My boys and I raise them. Whenever we see an egg or a small caterpillar, we raise it and we watch that amazing, majestic creature come out. So silk moths, and then I don't really have a favorite plant. That's really hard to choose.
They're all wonderful. So if I'm somebody who wants to put some new landscaping in, I'm starting to think about that for the spring coming up. Where would you suggest a person start? Where do they start with that?
I would see if you have any local growers that grow native plants. Natives are always the best thing that you can do. They're much more beautiful and interesting than most people realize. And like I said, a lot of our wildlife has adapted alongside these native plants. So, you'll always see something new when you start using natives. So I would see if you have a local grower, and if you can't find a local grower, there's a lot of resources and places online where you can order plants and you can find out if they're sourced. The seeds were sourced from an area close to you, which is really important, or if they're native to your region and your zone.
Yeah, I think as somebody who's dabbled in, I've learned so much over the years, but when we first started, I didn't worry about that sourcing and that genetic integrity of your, and just how important that is. Hugely important, and really an interesting thing to study. I follow-up of your monitoring program. Is your monitoring program similar to something like, is it a citizen scientist based kind of a monitoring program where somebody could get trained and volunteer for it, or?
Yes, it is. We do hold trainings usually once or twice a year, and we're always looking for volunteers and people that are interested in helping us get a better idea of where these symptoms are and aren't showing up across the state.
Citizen scientry is it's so cool, and I know for a lot of how important it is to be involved in that. So hopefully there's some people watching who'd be willing to do that. I have one last question.
Okay.
Because I'm dying to know. Okay. So I'm a limnologist. I'm a freshwater scientist before and so when I think about all of the things I get to study, there are three that are my favorite. Oh, and another question came in. Pattern. So studying patterns, studying cause and effect, or studying structure and function. Do you have a favorite? Patterns, cause and effect, or structure and function? So your favorite.
Structure and function.
Yes, mine too. Okay, why? Why? Why do you love structure and function?
Because it's fascinating. I mean, it's that place that you kind of learn how to fit things together and how they work, and there's always a new piece of information to learn or a mystery that can be solved. And I don't know, it's just really fascinating to see how things have evolved and what their purpose is for that evolution. So it's pretty cool.
It is so cool. I love that part. So you have a fan just said, thanks, Kim, you were great. And then also the question, should we be looking for trees that are not as damaged by herbicides and new varieties? So should we be looking for trees that are not as damaged by herbicides to maybe, maybe we should be planting them, I think is what they mean.
Well, I think, if you know that your area that you live in is experiencing this phenomenon, if you're seeing trees that have symptoms in your area frequently, and you're seeing trees that are becoming sick or weakened, then it is a good idea to, contact some weed scientists or some arborists and try to find some species that we think are going to be more resilient to herbicide drift and damage. You're not going to probably want to plant a redbud right now if in your yard if you're experiencing herbicide drift around you. So I think that it is with a landscaping mindset that would be valuable. But I think that ecologically we can't do that. We need all of these different species. What we need to do is we need to try to solve this problem and reduce the threats as much as we can.
Very common message, even when we're talking to people, scientists, water conservation, it's not finding a new source of water, it's conserving what we have and making sure that what we have in place, that self-sustaining mechanisms that the earth has. So yeah. You were wonderful, and I really enjoyed you. Everyone, this was Kim's first time participating with the National Biodiversity Teach-In, and you were wonderful, and I hope that next year you'll join us again.
Thank you.
I learned so much from you.
And it was fun.
Good. Oh, good. Well, thank you for your time, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you. Take care.
All right.